www.wrmi.net. Send us your comments and reception reports to info@wrmi.net.
Into Freedom Synergy Radio from WRMI, Okeechobee, Florida, USA. If you'd like a QSL card from Freedom Synergy Radio, just send us a reception report mentioning the day, time, and frequency you are listening to, which is 5,800 kilohertz. Send your report to radiomiami9@gmail.com. That's radiomiami9@gmail.com.
Freedom Synergy Radio.
Hello and welcome to Freedom Synergy Radio. My name is Donatella Ungreda. Thank you for tuning in to our show. Human rights have confronted serious challenges, and the global body entrusted to protect them, the UN Human Rights Council, has not fulfilled its role. The Council has been widely criticized for not holding its own members accountable for human rights violations. Following, let's listen to a report made by Rupa Shinoy from the news media The World, published on February 23, which goes into further details. Take a listen.
Across the globe, there is a single international organization entrusted with the promotion and protection of human rights. That's the United Nations Human Rights Council. Today, it's holding its first regular session since President Biden took office. The White House is rejoining the council in an observer role. As the world's Rupa Shinoy reports, there's a lot at stake right now, and action is needed urgently.
The UN Secretary General says COVID-19 has caused a pandemic of human rights abuses. Situations in Myanmar, Venezuela, Syria, South Sudan, and Sri Lanka are on the Human Rights Council's docket. Egypt is also a central concern, as more than 100 NGOs call on the Human Rights Council, or HRC, to establish a way to monitor and report human rights violations there. David Kay is a law professor at the University of California at Irvine. He says the biggest challenge the HRC may face is itself.
The biggest challenge is just its credibility on the international scene.
Because it hasn't held its own members accountable for human rights violations, Kay says. That was one of the Trump administration's criticisms when it withdrew U.S. participation in 2018. Kay says the U.S. left a vacuum that allowed China to increase its influence.
China is committing some of the most serious human rights abuses in the world. While they're doing that, they are also seeking to play a pretty active role on the council itself.
To address that, Kay says the U.S. needs to support actions that hold even its friends accountable, from Saudi Arabia to Egypt to Poland, Hungary, and Israel. And he says the U.S. needs to account for its own human rights abuses, something it's not prepared to do.
Historically, the United States has simply not implemented its human rights obligations in the United States. There's no human rights, let's say, culture and infrastructure in the United States.
That was highlighted last year when Minnesota police killed George Floyd and anti-racism protests spread across the U.S. and the world. African countries asked the Council to establish an independent commission of inquiry to investigate police brutality in the U.S. The U.S. to focus on all countries and just make it a report from the High Commissioner for Human Rights. An update on that report is due next month, and many groups will be closely watching how the U.S. reacts, says Salma Al-Husseini of the International Service for Human Rights.
We look forward to seeing the United States constructively engage in good faith with this process, with the report, and with genuine self-reflection and commitment towards change.
That will be one of the early tests of the U.S.'s renewed commitment to the Human Rights Council, Hosseini says. Meanwhile, there are people paying a cost for a lack of progress at the HRC. The human rights workers on the ground who report to the council. Shamini Darshni Kalimutu works with some of them as executive director of the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development in Bangkok.
Without their participation, it would be impossible for diplomats sitting in Geneva or New York to make an informed decision about what is happening, say, for example, in Myanmar or Sri Lanka.
But human rights workers face increasing reprisals. They're receiving death threats threats and being jailed by their home countries or having their passports confiscated.
Many defenders are constantly under state surveillance. Some have been labeled as terrorists. They face trumped-up criminal charges under draconian terrorism and other laws. Many are in detention.
Kalimutu says atrocities in some parts of the world are going unaddressed because it's too dangerous for human rights workers to report back. But she doesn't think countries committing violations should just be kicked off the council.
Even if states are complicit to attacks and reprisals against human rights defenders, we think that they should still have a seat at the table because it's peer pressure, right?
Peer pressure. It may be the only way to restore the Human Rights Council's credibility and use it to peacefully address the many dire human rights situations around the globe. For The World, I'm Rupa Shenoy.
From PRX.
Today we have a very interesting conversation with Mr. Frank Carlson, who is a human rights activist, political scientist, writer, former executive director of the Center for a Free Cuba, and before that he was a representative in Washington for Freedom House. We are going to talk today about what it means for the United States in general to respect human rights when President Joe Biden stops using the term genocide to refer to what is occurring in China with the Uyghur ethnicity and instead calls it a different norm. A similar position has taken Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We will also be discussing the growing anti-Chinese sentiment in Southeast Asia and the relationship of colored people in China with the Chinese Communist Party. So, welcome, Mr. Carlson, to Freedom Synergy Radio.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be with you.
Our pleasure. Mr. Carlson, President Biden is dismissing the genocide against the Uyghur population in China, dubbing the mass internment as a different norm. Is President Biden trying to justify the unjustifiable? Isn't it true that human rights are universal? And what China is doing with the Uyghurs is a blatant violation of the human rights, and there is no place for cultural justification when it comes to human rights.
Well, President Biden gave an interview a few days ago in which he said a number of things. One, what he did was to quote or to relay to the American people what the Chinese dictator had told. The Chinese, for many years, have argued that there are cultural differences and that those have to be taken into account, and that China should not be condemned for its human rights policies. Unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that all dictatorships, whether it's Iran or North Korea or Saudi Arabia, these are governments that claim that different standards should be applied to them. In the same interview, nevertheless, President Biden did say that he was hoping that American foreign policy would be in line with American ideas. It remains to be seen what happens in the next few weeks as far as the position of the administration in regard to China, particularly at a time when China has taken a very aggressive posture in regard to Taiwan, in regard to Hong Kong, and continues to send thousands of dissidents to concentration camps.
We at Freedom Synergy Radio have been following what the behavior regarding the human rights of China has been, especially recently. And I am very concerned that this behavior is used to justify their violation of human rights and call it cultural differences. Again, my question at the beginning was, are not the human rights equal to everybody because we are human beings? And the human rights are that because they are to protect humans? What is your take on that?
Well, we're talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says universal. It means it applies to everyone.
Right.
China, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela are countries that are signatories of that declaration. Nevertheless, they ignore what it says. Fortunately, as I'm sure your listeners are aware of, the United States is a lot more than the president or the new president and the American government. Yes. The United States is also a very, very vigorous human rights community, whether it's Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Foundation on Victims of Communism, and newspapers and labor leaders who I'm sure are concerned about the violation of worker rights in China and in other places. So I would say that President Biden means well. That doesn't mean that the policies that he could implement are going to be in line with American interests or American ideas. But it remains to be seen. The president has been in for a month. And he made some announcements early on, and then some adjustments have been made. For example, candidate Biden said that everything that President President Trump have put in place was going to be ended. Well, that's not exactly what happened. For example, Mr. Trump moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in Israel, something that had been promised. And, Biden has said that will remain the way it is. Now, the chairman of a committee on foreign relations of the Senate is a Democrat, Senator Robert Menendez. Okay. Senator Menendez is a Democrat from New Jersey, and he's a strong advocate of human rights. Now, to the degree the administration pays attention to Menendez and others, the president will make adjustments in his statements in the future.
I see, but the same position has taken Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He also refused to acknowledge Uyghur genocide, alleging that genocide is a very heavy word to define what is happening in Xinjiang. And I quote here, the international community takes the use of this term very seriously, he said, and that evidence of a genocide indeed occurring was necessary. My question is, what other evidence does the Canadian leader need to see to acknowledge genocide in China?
I understand where you're coming from, and you're doing a pretty good job at outlining the issues. What I'm telling you is that one is early in the process, and two, I'm willing to give both Prime Minister Trudeau and President Obama the benefit of the doubt that I'm holding judgment, and at the same time, I know whether it's used genocide or something else, we should not be judging foreign policy on the basis of one word. Although if anybody looks at China, whether it's Amnesty International or other human rights organizations, they all use that word because, in fact, what happened in China is despicable, and the Chinese government is violating all kinds of human rights. The Chinese government in the past was engaged in what they call harvesting of organs.
Correct.
What that was a political prisoner that was to be executed, was not killed, was taken to the hospital, and in the operating room they would remove their heart and other organs that could be transplanted. That is the kind of the barbarous policy of the Communist Party of China in regard to human rights.
2 days after Prime Minister Trudeau gave those remarks, the Canadian Parliament declared China's treatment of Uyghurs genocide. The motion, which passed 266-0, was supported by all opposition parties and a handful of lawmakers from the governing Liberal Party. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and most members of his cabinet abstained. The motion makes Canada just the second country after the United States to recognize China's actions as genocide. Lawmakers also voted to pass an amendment asking Canada to call on the International Olympic Committee to move the 2022 Winter Olympics from Beijing if the Chinese government continues this genocide. China responded late on Tuesday, saying it condemned and rejected Canada's motion, according to a Reuters report. It quoted Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin as saying that China had lodged stern representations with Canada. Mr. Trudeau has so far been hesitant to label China's actions against the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang a genocide, calling the term, and quote, extremely loaded, and saying further examination was needed before a decision could be made. Just one member of his cabinet, Foreign Affairs Minister Marc Garneau, appeared in Parliament for the vote. Speaking in the House of Commons, Mr. Garneau said he had abstained on behalf of the Government of Canada. Speaking ahead of the vote, Opposition Leader Erin O'Toole said the move was necessary to send a clear and unequivocal signal that we will stand up for human rights and the dignity of human rights, even if it means sacrificing some economic opportunity. In an open letter to Mr. Trudeau earlier this month, asking him to stand up to China, Mr. O'Toole noted the recent banning of BBC World News from China, a decision followed after a BBC report alleging systematic rape, sexual abuse, and torture in China's re-education camps in Xinjiang. Monday's non-abiding motion marks the latest escalation in Canada-China relations, which have soured over recent years. China's ambassador to Canada, Kong Piu, had earlier told the Canadian press that the motion was interfering in China's domestic affairs. We firmly oppose that because it runs counter to facts, he said. There is nothing like genocide happening in Xinjiang at all. Rights groups believe that China has detained up to 1 million Uyghurs over the past few years in what the state defines as re-education camps. BBC investigation suggests that Uyghurs are being used as forced labor. Canada's symbolic motion does not lay out next steps, but says the Canadian government needs to follow the lead of its U.S. neighbors. Both the current and former U.S. Secretaries of State, Antony Blinken and Mike Pompeo, have declared that China's policies against Uyghur Muslims and other ethnic minorities in its western Xinjiang region constitute genocide. There is a growing anti-Chinese sentiment across Southeast Asia. Many young people see parallels between the 2019 Hong Kong protests and their own resistance against local authoritarianism. We all know how China strives to save the faith at all costs. Of its policy toward its neighbors?
Well, the concern of Australia, New Zealand, and like Japan are not limited to the tragedy, the outrage of incredible violations of human rights in China. The international concern in the region extends to Chinese hostile policies targeting neighbors. China is a major superpower. China has been flying warplanes very near the airspace of Taiwan, and China continues to claim that Taiwan is part of China and that they will take it over. Now, if the Chinese come to the conclusion that they can in any way get away with something like that, and that President Biden will not deploy naval assets and do whatever is necessary to protect Taiwan, then the likelihood of war in the Formosa Straits will be likely.
I see. I have a last question for you, Mr. Carlson. I don't know if you were aware that the Chinese state TV included dancers in blackface portraying Africans during a national broadcast as Asia welcomed the lunar year of the ox. China's ruling Communist Party tries to promote an image of unity with African nations as fellow developing economies. On Twitter, there was a group called Black Liberty China, who is of African descent, who worked in or with China, and called the broadcast, and quote, extremely disappointing. How has the relationship between China and Africa been historically? Why would these people of African descent say something like that?
Well, anyone who lives inside China would have a very difficult time, unless it was a dissident like the late Chinese dissident leader Harry Wu, who spent years in the Chinese prison camps. But most other people in China, particularly foreigners, are going to echo very closely the Chinese official line. China has a very, very ambitious outreach program, not only in China but in other places around the world. In the United States, in many universities, until Mr. Trump came to the White House, China was expanding a series of institutes in American universities that taught American students the propaganda line of the Chinese, and more horrifying is that these groups were used to try to prevent speakers critical of Chinese abuses to appear on campus.
Okay, my question was about the African descent population in China. Is there a lot of it? Is there an historical relationship with African descent people besides economic new developments?
Well, China is a huge country, one of perhaps the largest, with the largest population, or one of the largest in the world. The relationship of, we cannot talk about folks of African descent in China and try to understand what they're saying without out of context. China is spending lots of money in so-called development aid, which means Chinese companies establishing their operations throughout Africa. The same thing applies in Latin America. So that all of this is very, very, very unfortunate, and I would hope that there would be congressional hearings at the Senate and the House of Representatives, and that American newspaper and electronic media will cover those hearings, because in the final analysis, American foreign policy across the board, including China, reflects or will reflect the opinions of the American people.
Well, thank you, Mr. Carlson, for all the time you have taken to explain us these important matters today. I certainly thank you for sharing your time and knowledge with us. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you very much. Let me extend a warm welcome to all of your listeners. This is a critical time, and folks who listen to this broadcast ought to get in touch with the newspapers, the government, the American embassy in their capitals, and express their views.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Freedom Synergy Radio. My name is Donatella Ungretta. Until next time.
Thank you very much, and God bless you. Bye.
Bye.
Freedom Synergy Radio. Freedom Synergy Radio.
Hello and welcome to Freedom Synergy Radio. Thank you for being there, tuning into our show. On a previous show, we had the pleasure to have with us Mr. Joseph Haj, international political analyst, sharing with us his thoughts about the shrinking of China's timeline to take over Taiwan. Today, Mr. Haj will share with us his thoughts of another type of Chinese interference. This time, in many U.S. colleges and universities, through apparently innocuous activities such as sports events or even language learning. Thank you again for being with us, Mr. Haj.
Thank you for the invitation. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you again. So, China is also very good at influencing in more subtle, but at the same time more perverse ways, with premeditation and calculation. We can see examples of pressuring public opinion through cultural, sporting, educational agreements that are always accompanied with some form of more or less veiled extortion, which generally includes high sums of money. Such is the case, I think you heard about it, of the Major League Baseball that decided to pull out of Georgia the draft and All-Star game in protest against the electoral reforms enacted recently by the state. Coincidentally, the Major League Baseball signed a broadcasting agreement with China technology giant Tencent the day before. In your opinion, why are American corporations still falling under this type of pressure?
I don't see it as falling under the pressure. On the contrary, seeking the money. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the loyalty of stockholder in this free economy has become the U.S. dollar, the profit, not the country, not the values, not the principles, not freedom or civil liberties. Mm-hmm. It is very unfortunate, and now we see the case of the Major League Baseball, but couple of years ago, it was the same story with Hollywood studios. Mm-hmm. And before that, it was with the NBA when one of the famous players was very offended because some other player mentioned something about China, and we found out that his contract was for millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. So it's very saddening to see those players that stand up for Black Lives Matter, stand up for Me Too movement, mm-hmm. all these civil liberty organization and freedom in the United States, but at the same time they throw a blind eye on what's going on in China. Mm-hmm. So if the Chinese want to really do propaganda on their own, all they can do is give stories that nobody believes. But when stars, be it on the movie star or players stars or whoever is in what we call in cahoot or in company with the Chinese conglomerate, mm-hmm. then we find out always that there is money involved. At the cost, now it's becoming at the cost of liberties and freedom in the United States. Mm-hmm. So what is the big deal in Georgia electoral law if it's not even as strict as other states have as of today? So the question is, how much influence are we going to allow for China in the United States? Be it at universities, be it at research centers, be it at research and development section of the university, or on the sports arena, and so on. We have another, what we call it, not crisis yet, but it is some kind of incursion on the intellectual and the production level in the United States. On the intellectual, the incursion is in labs and universities around the country. During the early months of the pandemic, one of the leading professors, American professors, was indicted with his Chinese counterpart that was working with him in a lab in the United States for receiving money from the Chinese Communist Party and planning to transfer all the technology that he discovered with his counterpart to take it to China and leave for China. So not only they are accused now and then of stealing intellectual property, at the same time they are buying the people who do the research and development to make it easy for them to produce whatever they want to produce, or to be at par with the other countries like the European, Western Europeans, and the United States and Canada. So in here we have a conflict that again they are using our values as a weak point to enter our society on the intellectual level, on the commercial level, or on the trade level. So we are faced with that, and some politicians don't see at all any problem with that. This is even bigger problem.
That's right.
If this is a bigger problem because they are the ones who are supposed to protect legally our institution, be it the political institution or the education system. So when we see some politician ambivalent to what's going on in our universities, in our research labs, and so on, we wonder what is behind it. And then we found out in few cases that there were really some interest of the Chinese in the campaign of A or in the campaign of B, or with the shining star, with the rise of a star of a politician, where most of his supporters are Chinese. And then there was other accusation that in aid to a congressman was Chinese intelligence agent, and she left before she was arrested. Another one, a senator, had a Chinese driver that was supposedly in the intelligence service for 10 or 15 years, and so it goes. So we are either doing it on purpose, ignoring all these incursions softly, or we are really ignorant. I doubt the word ignorant. Most of them don't see any harm from it, but the bottom line, there is a big harm. Why? Because they are competing with us on the education, on the research and development, on the economic side, with our own tools. So we are allowing them to this Congress Party of China to do whatever it pleases, whatever it undercut. It doesn't make a difference to us. The results are the same. They are acquiring what does not belong to them, and we are not giving it to them willingly. They are stealing it. So the bottom line, we are in a position where some institution in the government, with some politician, need to stand up and put an end to that. Because we need that, what we call it ASAP, because now it looks like it's growing, it's mushrooming. It's not growing at a small level. It is mushrooming from within our society. When we see what happened with the Major League Baseball, or what happened with the NBA, what's going to happen with XYZ, we don't need the Chinese to opinionate on our electoral laws. We are the voters. We decide, not them.
If you allow me, I will give you my humble personal opinion. I would say that in areas such as Hollywood or maybe sports, professional sports, there are two things. Chinese are abusing our good faith, and then there is lots of ignorance, because people are not able to understand what the real dangers of the Communist Party mean. Remember, we had on the 50s, last century in the 50s, there was like a witch hunt. There was McCarthy looking for communists everywhere, and that event was considered like a black episode of our contemporary history. I think people need to understand what the real dangers of the communist parties can do to societies, because we are being used by Chinese. As we have the example, there are the Confucius Institutes. These are Chinese government-backed centers that entangle colleges and universities with the Chinese Communist Party. You already mentioned a little bit of this. Many universities have closed closed some Confucius institutes, only to reopen them under other names, as warned by the National Associations of Scholars. How long has been this going on? I mean, how compromised are our colleges and universities now that we have come to realize that those entities entail the presence of the Chinese Communist Party right beside all our young students?
Well, you haven't said anything that I don't agree with. Therefore, it's the message that we need to rely to our voters about the threat of such an incursion on our university system, educational system in general. Because if we don't have a clear message for people to understand, they can always compare it to something else. It's like, okay, what happens if the English come here to that? Okay. So there has to be a very clear message. Unfortunately, the media is playing a major role in promoting those activities of China in here, because you cannot mention the word China without being accused of being racist.
Right.
Now, another thing, now it's like I have seen that in the last 3-4 months, that all of a sudden there is racism against Asian, attacks against Asian. Where did this come from? It's the narrative that the media start with to cover on something else. So when they start the narrative of something, they start something else. When they started the narrative about racism against black, all of a sudden Black Lives Matter flourished as one of the defense organization for civil rights. And all of a sudden another one that's Antifa, against fascism. And so they create the propaganda behind this kind of organization. Now I'm waiting for the organization that's going to come and defend the Asians from supposedly quote-unquote racism in the United States. So in here it is the easiest trick that the media can play, willingly or unwillingly, in order to create something out of nothing. And then they will march with it, but the end always justify the means for the media. And this is the worst thing that could happen to a civil society like ours, where freedom and civil rights are worshipped, not only applied. Now, they always pull from their arsenal examples of one incident or two incidents or even 10 incidents, but those are the incidents or the tragedy they highlight. It doesn't mean that the whole society is the same way. But unfortunately, we don't have enough media that focus on the real problem. That doctor that was arrested with his Chinese assistant counterpart in the lab, we barely, even though the FBI has done a press briefing and they announced the indictment, and all you barely could find it on the news. When I wanted to look for it a second time, I had to dig in YouTube for a few minutes. It wasn't easy to find.
Yeah.
So when the media covers for those, because this is not a generalized case. Yes, sir, it is generalized case, because we almost find out that in every university there are a group of Chinese students. If not half of them, most of them are members of the Chinese Communist Party. Why are they?
We have a nice example, Mr. Hash, because the World Health Organization didn't buy the report, to put an example of the COVID-19 and the surge of the virus. They didn't buy the report of where the virus came from. There's lots of people still thinking that it was something that escaped from a lab. And that piece of information that the World Health Organization does needs another or more deep research about the matter has not appeared in the media.
That World Health Organization is a sham on our organization.
I understand, but even so, someone is saying that a virus escaped from a lab. Well, the whole thing is being covered.
Everything is covered about that pandemic, about that virus. It's too late. The Chinese will never let all the institutions to find out We can only guess. We have a few people who escaped from China, asked for political asylum in the United States. They declared on TV and somewhere else, and they were considered like wacko people, that they have something missing in their head. They discredit everything that does not meet the standard of narrative that they are marketing. This is unfortunate because in the long run, we are going as people, as citizens of the United States and citizens of the Western world. If China gets away with all these tricks, with all these abuses, pay very high price in the future, with the future economies. That is going to be like kind of a dismantled almost on the principles of fake news. That's what happened. That's what happened when we don't look up and stop things from the beginning. Once the virus grows, be it economic virus or real virus, pandemic virus, and so on, then we could not put all the COVID-19 pandemic we lost. That was fastly contagious. It encompasses the whole world, and it's like some countries up to date that are paying the consequences. And no one is able to stand up and point fingers. When Australia stood up and point fingers at China, they were threatened completely. And when Australia found out that no country is going to stand up with them, they cooled down. So there are a lot of question marks about the media, especially in the United States, because in the United States is really the only country that are free to do whatever they want. They can do that elsewhere. So if the free press, the free media does not act in the United States, I don't expect them to act anywhere else. Absolutely. Probably here and there, somewhere, someone will go crazy and talk, but they discredit him immediately, and then there's any benefit from his statements. That's right. So we have a problem at hand, because the Chinese are using all the money that they made over the years, all these fortune at the hand of the Communist Party of China. They are buying influence, they are buying education, they are buying trade route, they are buying trade and raw material production in Latin America, they are buying raw material production in Africa. So they are going as fast as they can, and we will be surprised one day if China will not cut a lot of supply chain for a lot of things in response to any international bloc or any international sanctions against it.
But you know what? There are some people who are understanding what the situation is, and they are standing up. A few days ago, some GOP senators, GOP means the Republican Party for our audience, some GOP senators introduced legislation aimed at blunting the CCP's ideological penetration on American colleges' campuses. There is a senator, Marsha Blackburn. She is a Republican for Tennessee. She said that the United States cannot allow students to be, and quote, brainwashed with revisionist history, end quote, pushed by Confucius Institute. So the bill would require the universities to clearly delineate programs run by Confucius Institutes and those organized by their own Chinese language department. And the staff involved in the tenders must undergo background checks. But can this type of legislation help to effectively reduce the CCP's influence in colleges and universities? Are we on time for that?
Well, we are on time. It's better than nothing. Right. At least we can open some eyes. But what I'm worried about is more the cooperation of the universities than the law itself. Because if a university is really aware of all these Chinese incursion and influence in their ranks, and they haven't done anything about it, or they turn a blind eye about it, means that the law will probably be a hiccup for them, and they will continue doing whatever they're doing. I think we need something more serious. I know that Senator Blackburn is a very nice senator. senator, very decisive, very open about her stand on freedom and individual rights and so on. But there need to be a much bigger voice. Not only one senator, probably the whole government need to act on such things, because we're going to come to a point where they can undermine our systems, be it the electric power, or the nuclear power from within, because hackers, they work much easier from within the country than being assaulted from outside the country. So if they have all these students, they are willing to respond to the Chinese Communist Party or orders, then they are within our institution and they can execute any order. Then we have even a bigger threat from within than from China over here. So there is a lot of that incursion of Chinese on the institution or from the Confucius universities, what they call, and so on. That has wider angle when it is from within that we as citizens and as government need to address, because it cannot be left open, because the more they open, the more they establish themselves. And then with alternatives, if they close one door for them, they have another one open already. So yes, that legislation will help, but we need more to open the eyes of many, not only the few universities targeted by this legislation.
I am a little bit concerned because whenever you go to any university, mostly in the west of the country, and you show yourself as a conservative person, some people even would call security on you. Because your conservative ideals would be offensive to some. So when you start from that starting point, with this kind of legislation would be like, I don't think so.
They're not going to like it. They are not going to like it, but they're going to have, if it has the right support, they have to abide by it. And something that we find at universities around the country is always the conservative parties are kind of isolating themselves, kind of worried about the impression that they leave on other students. They should gather the same way that the lefties do get together with organizing events, organizing scheduled speeches and so on in every university. Also the conservative, even if they are only 10%, they should notice their presence on campuses. It's our withdrawal to avoid conflicts that cost us that these people are growing on campuses. Even though if you take secret, what we call it, or undercover polling, they are not majority sometimes, but people go with them because they intimidate people.
Absolutely.
So a lot of non-partisan, a lot of independent will go with the trend just to avoid any conflict. While the conservative, as long as they declare themselves conservatives, they get assaulted with accusations and so on. So we need to push back, teach people, young students who have and are from conservative background, to push back on all these accusations that if they are conservative, they are racist, as no connection, none whatsoever with these two. This is something that they used to work, and they are reusing it again. We should push back. We saw in a few instances that the pushback works, so they should do it, make it more general in all the universities, to push back on these cancel culture, on these pressure from lefties about they accusing someone of being patriot means he's a racist. If he's pro-American, he's racist. He is America first, he's racist. No, we are America first, because this is in reality, this is the land of the free, of the free. And then if we are free to give our opinion, it's our rights, it's the first right in the Constitution, and then that's what we should do, and defend it with all what we have, not getting intimidated by some schmucks on the street or at university.
Unfortunately, this is all the time we have for now, Mr. Hash. Thank you so much
My
for
pleasure.
such an interesting analysis. Really.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation and have a nice time.
It's been a pleasure having you with us again, and to our kind audience. Thank you again for listening. My name is Donatella Ungreta. Until next time.
Freedom Synergy Radio.
Soy Alfonso Montealegre en Hilversum, Holanda, y esta es WRMI Radio Miami Internacional, Okeechobee, Florida, Estados Unidos de América. Envíenos sus comentarios e informes de recepción a info@wrmi.net o por correo normal, apartado postal 526852, Miami, Florida 33152, Estados Unidos de América.
Evil individuals or regimes? Why is it that they use the terms Nazi or fascist, but almost never communist? Given the unparalleled amount of human suffering communists have caused, why is communist so much less a term of revulsion than Nazi? Communists killed 70 million people in China, more than 20 million people in the Soviet Union, not including about 5 million Ukrainians, and almost 1 out of every 3 Cambodians. And communists enslaved entire nations in Russia, Vietnam, China, Eastern Europe, North Korea, Cuba, and much of Central Asia. They ruined the lives of well over 1 billion people. So why doesn't communism have the same terrible reputation as Nazism? Reason number 1, there is, simply put, widespread ignorance of the communist record. Whereas both right and left loathe Nazism and teach its evil history, the left, and I'm talking about the left, not traditional liberals, like Harry Truman or John F. Kennedy, has never loathed communism. And since the left dominates academia, almost no one teaches communism's evil history. Reason number 2, the Nazis carried out the Holocaust. Nothing matches the Holocaust for pure evil. The rounding up of virtually every Jewish man, woman, child, and baby on the European continent and sending them to die is unprecedented and unparalleled. The communists killed far more people than the Nazis, but never matched the Holocaust in the systemization of genocide. The uniqueness of the Holocaust and the enormous attention rightly paid to it have helped ensure that Nazism has a worse name than communism. Reason number 3, communism is based on nice-sounding theories. Nazism isn't. It's based on heinous-sounding theories. Intellectuals in general, including, of course, the intellectuals who write history, are seduced by words, so much so that they deem actions as less significant than words. For that reason, they haven't focused nearly as much attention on the horrific actions of communists as they have on the horrific actions of the Nazis. They dismiss the evils of communists as perversions of true communism, but they regard Nazi atrocities correctly as the logical and inevitable results of Nazism. Reason number 4. Germans have thoroughly exposed the evils of Nazism, have taken responsibility for them, and have attempted to atone for them. Russians have not done anything similar regarding Lenin's or Stalin's horrors. To the contrary, Lenin, the father of Soviet communism, is still widely venerated in Russia. And as regards Stalin, as University of London Russian historian Donald Rayfield puts it, quote, people still deny, by assertion or implication, Stalin's Holocaust, unquote. Even less so as China exposed the greatest mass murderer and enslaver of them all, Mao Zedong. Mao remains revered in China. Every Chinese currency note has his picture on it. Until Russia and China and Vietnam and Cuba and North Korea acknowledge the evils their countries committed under communism, communism's evils will remain less known than the evils of the German state under Hitler. Reason number 5. Communists murdered mostly their own people. The Nazis, on the other hand, killed very few fellow Germans. World opinion, that largely meaningless and amoral term, deems the murder of members of one's own group far less noteworthy than the murder of outsiders. That's why, for example, blacks killing millions of fellow blacks in Africa elicits almost no attention from world opinion. And reason number 6. In the view of the left, the last good war was World War II, the war against German Nazism and Japanese fascism. The left does not regard wars against communist regimes as good wars. For example, the American war against Vietnamese communism is regarded as immoral, and the war against Korean communism and its Chinese communist backers is simply ignored. Until the left and all the institutions influenced by the left acknowledge how evil communism has been, we will continue to live in a morally confused world. In the meantime, all good people owe it to the victims of communism to learn what happened to them. Even worse than being murdered or enslaved is a world that doesn't even know that you were. I'm Dennis Prager. To keep our videos free, click here.
Freedom Synergy Radio from WRMI, Okeechobee, Florida, USA. If you'd like a QSL card from Freedom Synergy Radio, just send us a reception report mentioning the day, time, and frequency you were listening to, which is 5,800 kilohertz. Send your report to radiomiami9@gmail.com. That's radiomiami9@gmail.com.
Esta es WRMI, Radio Miami Internacional, Okeechobee, Florida, Estados Unidos de América. Envíenos sus comentarios e informes de recepción a info@wrmi.net o por correo regular a WRMI, apartado postal 526852, Miami, Florida 33152, Estados Unidos de América.
Radio Prague International, the external service of Czech Radio.